Sarah Mitchell had always dreamed of serving her country, but she never imagined it would be like this. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, she looked smaller than she felt as she walked through the dusty corridors of Forward Operating Base Falcon in Afghanistan. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete buildings, and the constant hum of generators filled the air with a mechanical drone that had become the soundtrack of her life. It was her 3rd month at the base, and Sarah had quickly established herself as one of the most dedicated nurses in the medical unit. She worked 12-hour shifts without complaint, treating everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries from IED explosions. Her hands never shook, even when removing shrapnel from a 19-year-old soldier's chest or comforting a wounded Marine who cried for his mother. But despite her competence and dedication, Sarah found herself the target of a group of soldiers who seemed to take pleasure in making her life miserable. The group was led by Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, a stocky man with dark eyes and a permanent sneer. He had been deployed multiple times and carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his combat experience made him superior to everyone else, especially medical personnel who, in his words, just patched people up while real soldiers did the fighting. Rodriguez had gathered around him a small crew of like-minded soldiers. Corporal Jake Thompson, a lanky kid from Texas who laughed too loudly at everything Rodriguez said. Private First Class Danny Chen, who despite his quiet nature seemed to enjoy the chaos his friends created, and Specialist Mike Foster, whose bulk and aggressive demeanor made him the muscle of the group. The taunting had started small. Rodriguez would make comments about how nurses were playing doctor when Sarah passed by their table in the mess hall. Thompson would deliberately bump into her when she was carrying medical supplies, causing her to drop bandages and antiseptic bottles across the floor. Chen would whisper jokes about her appearance just loud enough for her to hear, while Foster would block doorways, forcing her to ask permission to pass through areas where she had every right to be. Sarah tried to ignore them at first. She had dealt with bullies before, and she knew that engaging would only make things worse. She focused on her work, on the soldiers who needed her care, on the letters she wrote home to her parents in Ohio. But as the weeks passed, the harassment escalated. One particularly hot afternoon, Sarah was rushing to the medical tent with a fresh supply of antibiotics when Rodriguez stepped directly into her path. The medication scattered across the ground, some of the vials breaking on the concrete. "Oops," Rodriguez said with mock concern. "Looks like Nurse Sarah can't handle her job. Maybe you should go home and let the real medical personnel handle things here." Thompson and the others gathered around, forming a circle that prevented Sarah from easily collecting the scattered supplies. Soldiers from other units watched but didn't intervene. The unspoken rule at the base was that you didn't get involved in other people's problems unless it directly affected your mission. "Please move," Sarah said quietly, kneeling to gather the unbroken vials. "I need to get these to the medical unit." "Oh, she says please," Foster laughed, his voice booming across the compound. "How polite. Maybe if you ask real nice, we might let you through." Sarah's face burned with embarrassment as she continued collecting the supplies. A few other soldiers had stopped to watch, but none offered to help. She felt completely alone, surrounded by men who were supposed to be her comrades, but treated her like an enemy. "You know what I think?" Rodriguez continued, crouching down next to her. "I think you're only here because they needed to fill some diversity quota. Pretty girl in a war zone makes good propaganda photos, right? But when things get real, when bullets start flying, you'll be the first one hiding in a bunker." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she placed the last unbroken vial in her medical bag. She had never hidden from anything in her life. She had volunteered for this deployment, had specifically requested assignment to a forward operating base where she could make the biggest difference. But Rodriguez's words stung because they echoed her own deepest fears about how others perceived her. I've treated more wounded soldiers in 3 months than you've probably seen in your entire career, Sarah said, standing up slowly. Her voice was steady despite the anger building inside her. Rodriguez's expression darkened. Is that so? Well, let me tell you something, nurse. When the shooting starts, when mortars are falling around this base, we'll see how tough you really are. We'll see if you can handle real pressure or if you'll crack like all the other... He was interrupted by the distant sound of helicopter rotors. All conversation stopped as everyone turned toward the sky. In a war zone, helicopters could mean anything. Supply drops, medical evacuations, reinforcements, or enemy contact. The sound grew louder, and soon a black dot appeared against the bright blue sky. Incoming chopper, Chen said unnecessarily. Wonder what that's about. The helicopter was still several minutes away, but its presence changed the dynamics of the situation. Rodriguez straightened up, his attention momentarily diverted from tormenting Sarah. She used the opportunity to step back, creating distance between herself and the group. But Rodriguez wasn't finished with her yet. As the helicopter grew closer, he turned back to Sarah with renewed malice in his eyes. Don't think this is over, nurse, he said. You might be able to patch up cuts and bruises, but this is a combat zone. Sooner or later, you're going to face something that requires real courage, real skill. And when that happens, we'll all see what you're really made of. The helicopter was close enough now that they could see it was an Apache attack helicopter, its sleek, menacing form cutting through the desert air like a predator. These aircraft didn't usually land at their base unless something serious was happening. Apache helicopters were for combat missions, for providing close air support to ground troops engaged with enemy forces. Sarah felt a chill despite the overwhelming heat. Apache helicopters meant serious business, and their arrival could signal anything from an incoming attack to a major operation being launched. She needed to get back to the medical unit to prepare for whatever might be coming. I need to go, Sarah said, adjusting her grip on the medical bag. Nobody dismissed you, Rodriguez snapped. We were having a conversation. The conversation is over, Sarah replied, her voice firmer now. The approaching helicopter had reminded her of why she was really here. Not to engage in petty conflicts with bullies, but to save lives and serve her country. She started to walk away, but Foster moved to block her path again. The big man crossed his arms and stared down at her with undisguised hostility. Rodriguez was talking to you, Foster said. It's rude to walk away when someone's talking to you. The Apache helicopter was directly overhead now, its rotors creating a thunderous roar that made conversation difficult. The crew chief had radioed the control tower, requesting permission to land on the helicopter pad near the command center. Soldiers throughout the base were stopping their activities to watch the aircraft's approach. Sarah looked up at the imposing war machine circling above them, then back at the 4 soldiers who had made her life miserable for months. Something inside her had changed during the confrontation. Maybe it was the broken medical supplies. Maybe it was Rodriguez's accusation about her courage. Or maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of months of harassment. But she was no longer the quiet, tolerant nurse who tried to avoid conflict. Get out of my way, Sarah said to Foster, her voice cutting through the helicopter noise. I have work to do. Foster laughed and looked at Rodriguez for approval. The staff sergeant nodded, encouraging his subordinate to continue the intimidation. Make me, Foster said, stepping closer to Sarah. You think because you're a woman, because you're a nurse, that means we have to treat you special? This isn't some civilian hospital. This is a war zone. You want respect? Earn it. The Apache helicopter had completed its circle and was beginning its descent toward the landing pad. The powerful downdraft from its rotors was kicking up dust clouds that stung everyone's eyes and made breathing difficult. Soldiers across the base were shielding their faces and moving away from the landing area. Sarah wiped dust from her eyes and looked directly at Foster. She was tired of being intimidated, tired of walking away from confrontations, tired of letting these men make her feel small and powerless. "I earn my respect every day," Sarah said, raising her voice to be heard over the helicopter. "Every time I save a soldier's life, every time I work through the night to keep someone's son or daughter alive long enough to get home to their family. Every time I hold someone's hand while they die, thousands of miles from everyone they love." Her words seemed to surprise the group. Rodriguez's confident smirk faltered slightly, and Thompson stopped his nervous laughter. Even Foster appeared momentarily uncertain. "You think courage is about carrying a gun and kicking down doors," Sarah continued. "But real courage is looking into the eyes of a dying 18-year-old and promising him he's going to be okay, even when you know he isn't. Real courage is working on a soldier who's missing half his chest while mortars are falling around the medical tent. Real courage is getting up every day and trying to save lives in a place where everything is designed to take them." The Apache helicopter touched down on the landing pad with a tremendous roar of engines and whirling rotors. Dust billowed everywhere, forcing everyone in the immediate area to cover their faces and move away from the landing zone. Through the swirling sand and debris, Sarah could see figures moving around the aircraft, but the details were obscured by the harsh conditions. "Nice speech," Rodriguez shouted over the noise. "But words don't mean anything here. When the real fighting starts, when lives are actually on the line, we'll see if you can back up all that pretty talk with action." The helicopter's engines were winding down now, the rotor speed decreasing as the crew went through their post-flight procedures. The dust clouds were beginning to settle, and normal conversation was becoming possible again. Sarah brushed sand from her uniform and checked her medical bag to ensure the remaining supplies hadn't been contaminated. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Sarah said. "My record speaks for itself. The soldiers I've treated, the lives I've saved, the doctors who work with me every day, they know what I'm capable of." "Your record," Thompson laughed. "What record? Putting bandages on scraped knees? Giving aspirin for headaches? That's not real medicine. That's first aid." Sarah's anger flared at the dismissive comment. These men had no idea what she dealt with in the medical unit. They didn't see the soldiers who arrived with traumatic injuries that would have killed them within minutes without immediate intervention. They didn't understand the complex medical procedures she performed under primitive conditions, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. "Last week, I performed an emergency cricothyrotomy on a Marine who couldn't breathe because shrapnel had crushed his trachea," Sarah said. "I cut a hole in his throat with a scalpel and inserted a tube to keep him alive until the surgeons could operate. 2 days ago, I stopped arterial bleeding in a soldier's leg by manually compressing his femoral artery for 45 minutes while we waited for a medevac helicopter. 3 weeks ago, I helped deliver a baby in a village outside the wire when we were providing medical assistance to civilians." The men stared at her, perhaps beginning to realize that their assumptions about her work were based more on ignorance than fact. But Rodriguez's pride wouldn't let him back down from the confrontation he had started. "Anyone can follow procedures," Rodriguez said. "Real courage is about making life-or-death decisions when people are shooting at you. It's about—" He was interrupted by a voice calling across the base's main courtyard. Someone was shouting a name, but the words were unclear over the distance and the residual noise from the helicopter. All 5 of them turned toward the sound, trying to identify who was being called and why. The voice came again, clearer this time, and Sarah felt her heart stop. They were calling her name. "Sarah Mitchell!" The voice was deep, authoritative, and unmistakably military. "Is there a nurse Sarah Mitchell on this base?" Everyone in the immediate area turned to look at Sarah, including Rodriguez and his crew. The expression on Rodriguez's face had changed from smug superiority to confusion and perhaps a hint of concern. Who was looking for Sarah, and why were they calling for her immediately after landing in an Apache helicopter? Sarah looked toward the landing pad where figures were moving around the aircraft. One of them was walking directly toward the group, still partially obscured by the settling dust and heat distortion. But even from a distance, she could see that he was a large man in combat gear, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. "That's you they're calling," Chen said unnecessarily, stating the obvious. Sarah nodded but didn't move. Her mind was racing, trying to think of any reason why someone arriving in an Apache helicopter would be looking for her specifically. Had something happened to her family? Was there an emergency that required her immediate attention? Had she done something wrong that required disciplinary action? The figure was closer now, close enough that she could see he was wearing the distinctive uniform and equipment of Special Forces. The green beret, the advanced weapons and gear, the bearing that marked him as one of the elite soldiers most people only heard about in stories or movies. "Nurse Mitchell!" he called again, and this time there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. Rodriguez and his crew had gone completely silent. The bullying and taunting had stopped abruptly, replaced by the kind of respectful attention that Special Forces personnel commanded simply by their presence. These were the soldiers that other soldiers looked up to, the ones who conducted the most dangerous and important missions in the war. Sarah stepped forward, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hand. "I'm Nurse Mitchell," she called back. The Special Forces operator broke into a run, covering the remaining distance between them in seconds. As he got closer, Sarah could see more details. The professional-grade weapons, the communication equipment, the badges and patches that indicated extensive combat experience. This was not someone who made social calls or delivered routine messages. He stopped directly in front of her, his presence so commanding that Rodriguez and his crew automatically took several steps backward. Even Foster, with all his bulk and aggression, seemed to shrink in the presence of this elite warrior. "Nurse Sarah Mitchell from Mercy General Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio?" the operator asked. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The Special Forces soldier smiled, and suddenly his intimidating presence softened into something approaching warmth. "Ma'am, I'm Staff Sergeant Jake Wilson, 5th Special Forces Group. I've been looking for you." Sarah stared at him, completely bewildered. "Looking for me? I don't understand. We've never met." "No, ma'am, we haven't met. But 2 years ago, you saved my brother's life." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She searched her memory, trying to recall a patient named Wilson from her time at Mercy General. There had been so many patients, so many emergency situations, so many desperate efforts to save lives that seemed beyond saving. "Your brother?" she asked. "Tommy Wilson," Jake said. "Motorcycle accident on Interstate 71, massive internal bleeding, collapsed lung, traumatic brain injury. You were the trauma nurse who worked on him for 6 hours straight. You refused to give up when everyone else said he was too far gone. You kept him alive until the surgeons could get him stable." The memory came flooding back. Tommy Wilson, 23 years old, massive trauma from a motorcycle accident during a thunderstorm. He had been declared practically dead on arrival. But something about him had reminded Sarah of her younger brother. She had refused to accept that there was nothing more they could do. "Tommy," she whispered. "How is he?" "He's good, ma'am. Real good. He's married now, has a little girl named Sarah, named after you. He graduated from engineering school last year. He's alive and happy because you wouldn't give up on him." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. In her work, she rarely learned the long-term outcomes for the patients she treated. People came through the emergency room in crisis. She did everything she could to stabilize them, and then they moved on to other departments or other hospitals. She almost never found out whether her efforts had truly made a difference in their lives. "He's been trying to find you for 2 years, Jake continued, ever since he recovered enough to understand what happened that night. The hospital couldn't give out your information, and you had already enlisted by the time he was able to start looking. But he never gave up. When he found out I was deploying to Afghanistan, He asked me to try to find you." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her. Rodriguez and his crew were staring in obvious shock. Other soldiers had gathered to see what was happening, drawn by the unusual sight of a special forces operator engaging in what appeared to be a personal conversation in the middle of a combat zone. "He wanted me to give you this," Jake said, reaching into one of his cargo pockets and pulling out a small wrapped package. "And he wanted me to tell you that you're his hero. He says everything good in his life exists because you refused to give up on him when everyone else had written him off." Sarah took the package with trembling hands. It was light, obviously something personal rather than anything of significant monetary value. But the meaning behind it, the fact that a patient she had treated years ago in a completely different world still thought about her, still remembered what she had done, it was overwhelming. "And ma'am," Jake added, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "I wanted to thank you personally. Tommy is my only brother. Our parents died when we were kids, and we only had each other growing up. What you did for him, you did for me, too. You saved my family." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she stood in the middle of the Afghan desert, surrounded by soldiers, holding a gift from a patient she had never expected to hear from again. "There's more," Jake said gently. "Tommy wanted you to know that he's not the only one. He's been in touch with 3 other patients from that hospital who remembered you specifically, people whose lives you saved or changed during your time there. He started a group. People who want to find ways to honor medical personnel who went above and beyond." Sarah couldn't speak. The emotional weight of the moment was too much. She had spent months enduring harassment from Rodriguez and his crew, questioning whether she belonged here, whether she was making any real difference in the world. And now, suddenly, she was being reminded that her work mattered more than she could ever have imagined. "Tommy also wanted me to tell you," Jake continued, "that he knows what you're doing here is important, and he's proud that the person who saved his life is now saving other lives in one of the most dangerous places in the world. He says you're still his hero, and always will be." Sarah wiped her eyes and looked around at the assembled soldiers. Rodriguez was staring at her with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if he was seeing her for the first time. The arrogant, dismissive attitude he had maintained for months was nowhere to be found. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Jake. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for bringing this message. You have no idea what this means to me." Jake smiled and stepped back slightly, returning to a more professional posture. "Ma'am, there's one more thing," he said. "Tommy asked me to tell you that if you ever need anything at all, you just need to ask. He's successful now, he's got resources, and he's never forgotten what you did for him. Neither has his family." Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed by the entire situation. "And from me personally," Jake added, "if anyone on this base gives you any trouble at all, I want you to let me know. My team and I will be operating in this area for the next several months. People who save lives deserve respect, and anyone who doesn't understand that needs to be educated." His words were clearly directed at Rodriguez and his crew, though he never looked directly at them. The message was unmistakable. Sarah Mitchell was under the protection of special forces, and harassment would not be tolerated. Rodriguez and his followers had begun backing away from the group, clearly uncomfortable with the attention and the implicit threat in Jake's words. The man who had been so confident and aggressive just minutes earlier now looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "I need to get back to my team," Jake said to Sarah. "But it was an honor to meet you, ma'am. And Tommy wanted me to tell you that if you ever make it back to Ohio, you're always welcome at his house. His wife wants to cook you dinner and introduce you to little Sarah." Sarah laughed through her tears. "I would love that." Jake nodded, snapped to attention briefly in a gesture of respect, then turned and began walking back toward the Apache helicopter. His crew had been waiting patiently during the entire conversation, understanding that this was a personal matter that took precedence over military efficiency. Sarah watched him go, clutching the small package in her hands. Around her, the assembled soldiers began to disperse, returning to their duties with new understanding of who she was and what she had accomplished. But Rodriguez and his crew remained frozen in place, apparently unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. Sarah turned to face them, and for the first time in months, she felt truly confident in her position on the base. "Now," she said quietly, "was there something else you wanted to discuss?" Rodriguez opened his mouth, but no words came out. The man who had spent months questioning her courage, her competence, and her right to be in a combat zone had just watched a Special Forces operator seek her out specifically to honor her life-saving work. "Because if we're done here," Sarah continued, "I have soldiers to take care of. Real soldiers, who understand what medical personnel actually do in a war zone." She walked past the group without another word, her head held high for the first time in months. Behind her, she could hear the Apache helicopter's engines spinning up again, preparing for takeoff. Staff Sergeant Jake Wilson and his team were returning to their mission, but they had already accomplished something more important than any tactical objective. They had reminded Sarah Mitchell who she really was. The change on the base was immediate and unmistakable. Within hours of Staff Sergeant Wilson's visit, word had spread throughout Forward Operating Base Falcon about what had happened. Soldiers who had previously ignored Sarah now nodded respectfully when she passed. Others went out of their way to thank her for her service, sharing stories of friends or family members whose lives had been saved by dedicated medical personnel. Sarah noticed the difference most acutely in the mess hall. For months, she had eaten alone or with the other medical staff, avoided by most soldiers and actively shunned by Rodriguez's group. But on the evening after Jake Wilson's visit, she found herself surrounded by soldiers eager to talk with her, to hear about her experiences, and to share their own stories about medical care they had received. "Nurse Mitchell," called out Corporal Lisa Barnes, a communications specialist from Nebraska. "Mind if I sit with you?" Sarah looked up from her tray of military rations, surprised by the friendly invitation. "Of course. Please join me." Lisa sat down across from Sarah and was quickly joined by 3 other soldiers: Private Martinez from the motor pool, Sergeant Thompson from supply logistics, and Specialist Williams from intelligence. These were people who had been polite but distant during Sarah's time at the base, focused on their own duties and social circles. "We heard about what happened today," Martinez said. "That Special Forces guy was looking for you because you saved his brother's life." "That's right," Sarah replied, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. "It was 2 years ago, back when I worked at a civilian hospital in Ohio." "That's incredible," Williams said. "I mean, he flew here in an Apache helicopter just to find you and say thank you." Sarah smiled, remembering the encounter. "His brother Tommy was badly injured in a motorcycle accident. I was just doing my job, but apparently it meant more to him than I realized at the time." "Just doing your job," Thompson laughed. "Ma'am, with respect, Special Forces operators don't fly around in attack helicopters to thank people for just doing their job. You must have done something pretty amazing." Before Sarah could respond, she noticed a familiar figure approaching their table. Rodriguez was walking toward them, his expression uncertain and uncomfortable. His usual crew was nowhere to be seen, and he appeared to be alone for the first time since Sarah had been at the base. The conversation at the table stopped as Rodriguez reached them. The other soldiers looked up at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Word had also spread about his months of harassment toward Sarah, and his behavior was no longer viewed as acceptable even by those who had previously remained silent. "Nurse Mitchell," Rodriguez said quietly, "could I speak with you for a moment? Privately?" Sarah looked around the table at her new companions, then back at Rodriguez. 3 months ago, she would have been intimidated by his request, worried about what new humiliation he might have planned. But the events of the afternoon had changed everything. She felt stronger, more confident, more certain of her place on the base and her value as a soldier. "Anything you want to say to me, you can say in front of these soldiers," Sarah replied calmly. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, clearly preferring to have this conversation without an audience. But Sarah's tone made it clear that she was no longer willing to be isolated or cornered by him. "I wanted to apologize," Rodriguez said, the words coming out with obvious difficulty, "for the way I've treated you since you arrived here. It was unprofessional and wrong." The admission hung in the air like smoke. The other soldiers at the table stared at Rodriguez with surprise, clearly not expecting such a direct acknowledgement of his behavior. "I see," Sarah said simply, not making it easy for him. "I thought—" Rodriguez continued, then stopped and started again. "I made assumptions about you, about your experience and your capabilities that weren't fair. Today made me realize I was completely wrong about who you are and what you've done." Sarah studied his face, trying to determine whether this apology was genuine or simply motivated by fear of consequences now that she had powerful allies. She suspected it was probably a combination of both, but she also recognized that it took some degree of courage for him to approach her publicly like this. "You thought that because I'm a woman, because I'm medical personnel instead of combat arms, that I somehow didn't belong here," Sarah said. "You thought that my work was less important than yours, and that gave you the right to humiliate me in front of other soldiers." Rodriguez nodded reluctantly. "Yes, that's exactly what I thought. And I was wrong." "You were wrong about my qualifications and my experience," Sarah continued. "But you were also wrong about something more fundamental. You seem to believe that there's a hierarchy of service, that some jobs in the military are more important or more honorable than others. But we're all here for the same reason, to serve our country and protect each other." Martinez nodded approvingly at Sarah's words. "She's right, Rodriguez. We all wear the same uniform." "I know," Rodriguez said. "I've had some time to think about it this afternoon, and I know I was wrong. I'm hoping you might be willing to accept my apology and maybe start over." Sarah considered his request. She had no illusion that Rodriguez's underlying attitudes had changed overnight, but she also understood that military units functioned best when conflicts were resolved rather than allowed to fester. And she recognized that publicly accepting his apology would demonstrate the kind of leadership and professionalism that would serve her well in the future. "Apology accepted," Sarah said. "But I want to be clear about something. I don't need special treatment or protection from anyone. I just need the same respect that any soldier earns through competent service. If you can provide that, we won't have any problems." Rodriguez nodded again. "Understood. And for what it's worth, I've spoken with Thompson, Chen, and Foster. They'll be approaching you individually to offer their own apologies." "That's between them and me," Sarah replied. "But I appreciate you taking responsibility for the group's behavior." Rodriguez straightened up slightly, looking relieved that the conversation had gone better than he had apparently expected. "There's one more thing," he said. "I don't know if you're interested, but we're organizing a cross-training session next week. Combat personnel and support staff working together on tactical medical scenarios. If you're willing to participate, I think a lot of soldiers could learn from your experience." Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised by the invitation. Cross-training between combat and medical personnel was valuable but relatively rare, usually organized only when units had specific operational requirements. "What kind of scenarios?" she asked. "Casualty evacuation under fire, field treatment of traumatic injuries, coordination between medics and doctors during mass casualty events," Martinez explained. "The kind of stuff that could save lives if we ever get hit hard here." Williams nodded enthusiastically. "I think it's a great idea. Most of us know basic first aid, but we don't really understand what you medical people can do or how to help you do it better." Sarah felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect. This was exactly the kind of integration between medical and combat personnel that she had hoped to see during her deployment. Too often, medical staff were treated as completely separate from tactical operations, when in reality the two areas needed to work closely together to maximize effectiveness and save lives. "I'd be very interested in participating," Sarah said. "When and where?" "Next Thursday afternoon on the training range behind the motor pool," Rodriguez replied. "We've got permission to use smoke grenades and blank ammunition to make it realistic." "Count me in," Sarah said firmly. Rodriguez smiled, looking genuinely pleased by her agreement. "Excellent. I'll make sure you get all the details." As Rodriguez walked away, the soldiers at Sarah's table looked at her with something approaching awe. "That was impressive," Barnes said. 3 months of harassment, and when he finally apologizes, you just accept it and move forward. I don't think I would have been that professional about it." "Holding grudges doesn't help anyone," Sarah replied. "And besides, if he's genuinely willing to change his attitude, then the situation becomes better for everyone." The conversation continued for another hour, with soldiers sharing stories about their own experiences with military medicine and asking Sarah about her work both at the base and in her previous civilian position. For the first time since arriving at FOB Falcon, Sarah felt like she was truly part of the community rather than an outsider tolerated by necessity. But her sense of belonging was tested 3 days later when the base received an urgent radio transmission from a small outpost 20 kilometers to the south. Alpha Company's 3rd Platoon had been conducting a routine patrol when they triggered an improvised explosive device. The explosion had destroyed their lead vehicle and caused multiple casualties, but enemy fighters had opened fire before the soldiers could properly assess the wounded or call for helicopter evacuation. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the base commander, immediately convened an emergency meeting in the command center. Sarah was surprised to be included among the senior personnel summoned to discuss the response. "We have 4 confirmed wounded, possibly more," Morrison announced to the assembled group. "Alpha Company is requesting immediate medical evacuation, but the landing zone is still under enemy fire. Air assets are en route, but they can't land until we can suppress the enemy position." Major Stevens, the operations officer, pointed to a map of the area. "The enemy appears to be firing from a compound about 300 meters north of the IED site. We're sending Bravo Company to flank the position, but it's going to take at least an hour to get them in position and clear the area." Sarah studied the map, noting the distances and terrain features. An hour was too long for seriously wounded soldiers, especially if any of them had traumatic injuries requiring immediate intervention. "What about the wounded soldiers' conditions?" she asked. "Do we have any medical assessment?" Morrison looked surprised by the question, apparently not expecting medical personnel to speak up during a tactical briefing, but he quickly consulted his notes. The platoon leader reports 2 soldiers with serious injuries from the explosion, 1 with possible internal bleeding, and several others with various wounds from shrapnel and small arms fire. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Internal bleeding in a combat environment was often fatal unless treated quickly and aggressively. An hour delay could mean the difference between life and death. "Sir," she said, "if we have a soldier with internal bleeding, waiting an hour for evacuation could be too late." "What are you suggesting, Nurse Mitchell?" Morrison asked. Sarah hesitated, knowing that what she was about to propose would be considered highly irregular and potentially dangerous. "Sir, I'd like to volunteer to accompany the relief force to Alpha Company's position. If we can get me to the wounded soldiers before the evacuation helicopters arrive, I might be able to stabilize them enough to survive the wait." The room went silent. Every officer present stared at Sarah as if she had just volunteered to walk into enemy fire, which she realized was essentially what she had done. "Absolutely not," Major Stevens said immediately. Medical personnel don't accompany tactical operations. It's against protocol and unnecessarily dangerous. With respect, sir, Sarah replied. Medical personnel accompany tactical operations all the time. That's what combat medics do. And in this case, the tactical operation is specifically designed to rescue wounded soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison frowned, clearly torn between concern for Sarah's safety and recognition that her presence could significantly improve the wounded soldier's chances of survival. Nurse Mitchell, I appreciate your willingness to volunteer, but you're not trained for combat operations. You don't have the tactical knowledge or experience to operate in a hostile environment. Sir, I've been reading tactical manuals and observing training exercises since I arrived here, Sarah said. And more importantly, I have medical knowledge and experience that could save lives. Those soldiers don't need another rifle. They need someone who can stop internal bleeding and manage traumatic injuries. Captain Rodriguez, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up. Sir, if I may, he said, Nurse Mitchell is right about the medical situation, and if she's willing to volunteer for this mission, I think we should consider it seriously. Everyone in the room turned to look at Rodriguez with surprise. His public support for Sarah's proposal was unexpected, given their recent history of conflict. Furthermore, Rodriguez continued, if the concern is her lack of tactical training, I volunteer to personally ensure her safety during the operation. My squad can provide close protection while she works on the wounded. Sarah looked at Rodriguez with genuine surprise and gratitude. His offer to risk his own men to protect her was far beyond anything required by duty or regulation. It was a gesture that demonstrated real respect for her capabilities and commitment to the mission. That's a generous offer, Captain, Morrison said, but I'm still not comfortable sending a nurse into an active combat zone. Sir, Sarah said, those soldiers are wounded and under fire because they volunteered to serve their country in dangerous conditions. They accepted risk to accomplish their mission. I'm asking for the same opportunity to accept risk in order to accomplish mine. Major Stevens shook his head. It's not the same thing. You're medical personnel. Your job is to treat wounded soldiers after they've been evacuated to safety, not to go looking for them in combat zones. My job, Sarah replied firmly, is to save lives wherever and whenever possible. If that means going into a combat zone, then that's what I need to do. Morrison stood silent for several long moments, weighing the potential benefits against the obvious risks. Finally, he turned to address the room as a whole. What's the timeline on getting Bravo Company in position to suppress the enemy fire? He asked. 45 minutes to an hour, sir, Stevens replied. And how long would it take to get a relief force to Alpha Company's position? 20 minutes by vehicle, sir. Morrison nodded slowly. So if we send a relief force immediately, Nurse Mitchell could potentially be working on the wounded soldiers for 20 or 30 minutes before the area is completely secured. Yes, sir, Rodriguez confirmed. And my squad is experienced in providing security for medical operations. We can establish a defensive perimeter and protect Nurse Mitchell while she works. Sarah felt her heart racing with a combination of excitement and fear. This was exactly the kind of situation she had trained for, the reason she had volunteered for deployment to a forward operating base. But she also understood that she was proposing to put herself in genuine danger, far beyond anything she had experienced during her time at the base. All right, Morrison said finally. Here's what we're going to do. Captain Rodriguez, you'll lead a squad-sized element to Alpha Company's position immediately. Your primary mission is to provide security and assist with casualty evacuation. Nurse Mitchell, you'll accompany the relief force with the understanding that your safety cannot be guaranteed and that you'll be operating under combat conditions. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline and determination. Understood, sir. Captain Rodriguez, you are personally responsible for Nurse Mitchell's safety, Morrison continued. If the situation becomes too dangerous, you are authorized to override her medical judgment and order her evacuation. Rodriguez nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. One more thing, Morrison added, looking directly at Sarah. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Once we launch this operation, there's no turning back. Sarah thought briefly about Tommy Wilson, about the soldiers she had treated over the past 3 months, about the letter she had received that afternoon from a former patient who was now living a full life because someone had refused to give up on him. She thought about the oath she had taken as a nurse, the promise to heal and protect regardless of personal risk. Yes, sir, she said without hesitation. I'm certain. Morrison nodded. Then let's move. Time is critical. The next 30 minutes were a blur of preparation and activity. Sarah quickly gathered medical supplies, focusing on equipment for trauma surgery and blood loss management. Rodriguez assembled his squad and briefed them on the mission, emphasizing that protection of medical personnel was their primary responsibility. As Sarah loaded her medical gear into the back of an armored vehicle, she was approached by several soldiers who had heard about the mission. "Nurse Mitchell," Corporal Barnes called out, "we heard you're going out with the relief force." "That's right," Sarah replied, checking her supplies one final time. "We just wanted you to know," Private Martinez added, "that we think what you're doing is incredible. Those soldiers are lucky to have someone like you willing to risk everything for them." Williams nodded in agreement. "When you get back, drinks are on us." Sarah smiled, touched by their support. "When I get back, I'll take you up on that offer." Rodriguez appeared at the back of the vehicle, fully equipped with combat gear and weapons. "Ready to go, Nurse Mitchell?" he asked. Sarah shouldered her medical bag and climbed into the vehicle. "Ready." As the convoy pulled away from forward operating base Falcon, Sarah looked back at the soldiers who had gathered to watch them leave. Some were waving, others stood at attention in informal salutes. For the first time since arriving at the base, she felt like she was surrounded by comrades rather than strangers. "Nervous?" Rodriguez asked as they bounced over the rough desert road. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but ready." Rodriguez smiled. "Good. Terror keeps you alert. Just follow my lead once we get there. And remember that your job is to save lives, not to be a hero." "I understand." "And Nurse Mitchell," Rodriguez added, "for what it's worth, I think you're the bravest person I've ever served with." Sarah looked at him with surprise. 3 days earlier, this same man had been questioning her courage and her right to serve in a combat zone. Now he was leading a dangerous mission specifically to ensure she could accomplish her work. "Thank you," she said simply. The radio crackled with updates from Alpha Company. The wounded soldiers were still alive, but their conditions were deteriorating. Enemy fire had decreased, but not stopped entirely. The relief force was 20 minutes out. Sarah checked her equipment one final time and said a quiet prayer for the soldiers they were racing to save. In 20 minutes, she would find out whether months of training and preparation had adequately prepared her for the reality of practicing medicine under fire. The vehicle hit a particularly large bump, throwing everyone against the walls and reminding Sarah that they were driving through a war zone toward an active combat situation. But instead of fear, she felt a sense of clarity and purpose that she had never experienced before. This was why she had become a nurse. This was why she had enlisted. This was her chance to prove that medical personnel were not separate from the fight, but an integral part of it. The radio crackled again with an urgent transmission from Alpha Company. "Relief Force, this is Alpha 3-6. We need that medical support immediately. One of our wounded is going critical." Rodriguez grabbed the radio handset. "Alpha 3-6, this is Relief Force Actual. We're 15 minutes out with a trauma nurse. Hold tight." He looked at Sarah with an expression of complete confidence. "You ready to save some lives?" Sarah adjusted her grip on her medical bag and felt the familiar calm that came over her in emergency situations. "Let's go to work." The sound of gunfire grew louder as the convoy approached Alpha Company's position. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper rumble of American M4 carbines, punctuated by the occasional explosion of grenades or rocket-propelled grenades. The radio chatter had become more urgent, with reports of increasing enemy activity and deteriorating conditions for the wounded soldiers. 2 minutes out, the driver called back to Rodriguez and Sarah. Rodriguez checked his weapon and adjusted his body armor. Around them, his squad members were performing final equipment checks and reviewing hand signals they would use once they left the relative safety of the armored vehicles. "Remember," Rodriguez said to Sarah, "once we dismount, you stay close to me until we reach the wounded. Don't worry about anything except following my lead and keeping your head down. My soldiers will handle security." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. Through the small window of the armored vehicle, she could see smoke rising from the area ahead, evidence of the IED explosion and the ongoing firefight. The convoy slowed and then stopped behind a small rise that provided concealment from enemy observation. Rodriguez opened the rear door and immediately began issuing orders to his squad. "Thompson, Martinez, establish overwatch positions on that ridgeline. Williams, Foster, you're with me providing close security for the nurse. Everyone else, defensive perimeter around the vehicles. Nobody moves without my command." The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, spreading out into positions that would provide both security and fields of fire against potential enemy approaches. Sarah watched them work, impressed by their professionalism and coordination, despite the dangerous circumstances. "Alpha 3-6, this is Relief Force Actual," Rodriguez called into his radio. "We're in position. What's your status?" The response was immediate and tense. "Relief Force, we have 4 wounded soldiers behind the destroyed vehicle about 50 meters to your front. Enemy fire is intermittent but ongoing from the compound to the north. We can provide covering fire when you move to our position." Rodriguez looked at Sarah. "You ready for this?" Sarah adjusted her medical bag and took a deep breath. "Ready." "All right, people, let's move." The next few minutes were the most intense of Sarah's life. Following Rodriguez in a crouched run, she moved across open ground toward the smoking wreckage of Alpha Company's lead vehicle. Bullets occasionally cracked overhead or kicked up dust nearby, but Rodriguez's soldiers provided accurate suppressing fire that kept the enemy from taking careful aim. When they reached Alpha Company's position, Sarah immediately forgot about the danger and focused entirely on the wounded soldiers lying behind the destroyed Humvee. Her medical training took over, and she began rapidly assessing their conditions while Rodriguez's men established a defensive perimeter around her. The first soldier, a young private whose name tag read Johnson, had severe lacerations from shrapnel but was conscious and alert. Sarah quickly determined that his wounds, while painful and bloody, were not life-threatening. "You're going to be fine," she told him firmly. "I'm going to bandage these cuts, and then we'll get you evacuated." The second soldier was unconscious with obvious head trauma. Sarah checked his pulse and breathing, then carefully examined his skull for fractures or other signs of serious brain injury. His condition was serious but stable, requiring evacuation to a surgical facility, but not immediate life-saving intervention. The third soldier, Sergeant Davis, had taken shrapnel in his chest and was having difficulty breathing. Sarah immediately recognized the signs of a tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung that was preventing him from breathing properly and could be fatal within minutes if not treated. "I need to decompress his chest," Sarah called out to Rodriguez. "This is going to take a few minutes." Rodriguez nodded and increased the volume of covering fire from his soldiers. The sound of gunfire intensified as enemy fighters tried to take advantage of the stationary targets. Working with steady hands despite the chaos around her, Sarah located the correct position between Davis's ribs and carefully inserted a large needle to relieve the pressure in his chest cavity. Almost immediately, his breathing improved, and his color began to return to normal. "How you doing, Sergeant?" Sarah asked. Davis managed a weak smile. "Better now, ma'am. Thank you." But it was the fourth soldier who presented the greatest challenge. Corporal Michael Stevens had taken the full force of the IED blast and had massive internal injuries. He was unconscious, his pulse was weak and rapid, and his abdomen was distended with internal bleeding. Sarah quickly started an IV line to replace lost fluids, but she knew that without immediate surgical intervention, Stevens would die within the hour. The problem was that getting him to a surgical facility would require helicopter evacuation, and the landing zone was still under enemy fire. "Rodriguez," Sarah called out. "This one needs surgery immediately. How long until we can get a helicopter in here?" Rodriguez spoke quickly into his radio, then turned back to Sarah with a grim expression. "At least 20 minutes until Bravo Company can suppress the enemy fire enough for a helicopter to land safely." Sarah looked down at Stevens, calculating blood loss and vital signs. 20 minutes was too long. He would be dead before the helicopter arrived unless she could do something to stabilize him. "I need to operate," Sarah announced. Rodriguez stared at her in disbelief. "Operate? Here? Under fire?" "He's bleeding internally from what looks like a ruptured spleen," Sarah explained quickly. "If I don't control the bleeding, he'll die before we can evacuate him. I can do an emergency splenectomy with the equipment I brought." "You're talking about major surgery in the middle of a firefight," Rodriguez said. "I'm talking about saving a soldier's life," Sarah replied firmly. "This is why I came here." Rodriguez looked around at the ongoing battle, then back at Sarah. The decision was his to make as the mission commander, but Sarah could see in his expression that he understood the medical reality of the situation. "What do you need?" he asked. 20 minutes of uninterrupted time and enough covering fire to keep the enemy from getting close," Sarah said. "Can you give me that?" Rodriguez spoke into his radio again, coordinating with both Alpha Company and the approaching Bravo Company elements. After several minutes of radio traffic, he turned back to Sarah. "You've got it," he said. "Bravo Company is moving into position to provide supporting fire. Alpha Company will maintain the perimeter here. My squad will provide close security while you operate." Sarah had already begun preparing her equipment. Emergency surgery in a combat zone was not something taught in any nursing program, but her experience in trauma centers had given her the knowledge and skills necessary to attempt it. The risk was enormous, both to Stevens if the surgery failed, and to everyone else if the enemy launched a coordinated attack while she was focused on the operation. "I need someone to assist me," Sarah said. "Someone who can follow instructions exactly and won't panic under pressure." "I'll do it," Rodriguez volunteered immediately. Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Have you ever assisted in surgery before?" "No, but I've seen combat medics work on wounded soldiers. And I'm not going anywhere while you're saving one of my men." Sarah nodded, recognizing that Rodriguez's offer was about more than just medical assistance. He was demonstrating his complete confidence in her abilities and his willingness to share the responsibility for the outcome. Working quickly, Sarah established a sterile field as best as possible under the circumstances. The sound of gunfire continued around them, but Rodriguez's soldiers maintained an effective defensive perimeter that prevented enemy fighters from approaching their position. "All right, Corporal Stevens," Sarah said quietly to the unconscious soldier. "Let's get you fixed up." The surgery was the most challenging thing Sarah had ever attempted. Working with limited equipment under primitive conditions, she carefully opened Stevens's abdomen and located the source of the bleeding. As she had suspected, his spleen had been ruptured by the blast, causing massive internal hemorrhage. Rodriguez proved to be an excellent surgical assistant, following Sarah's instructions precisely and anticipating her needs despite his lack of medical training. When she needed additional lighting, he positioned himself to block the sun from her eyes. When she needed instruments, he had them ready before she asked. When she needed steady hands to hold tissue while she worked, he provided them without hesitation. "How much longer?" Rodriguez asked quietly, aware that they had been in the exposed position for nearly 15 minutes. "Almost done," Sarah replied, carefully removing the damaged spleen and checking for other sources of bleeding. "Just need to make sure everything is secure before I close." The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Bravo Company. "Relief force, this is Bravo 6. We're in position and beginning our assault on the enemy compound. Heavy resistance, but we should have them suppressed within 10 minutes. "Copy, Bravo 6, Rodriguez responded. "We need those extra 10 minutes. Sarah worked with intense concentration, blocking out the sounds of battle and focusing entirely on the delicate work of repairing Stevens's damaged organs. Years of emergency room experience had taught her to maintain steady hands and clear thinking, even under extreme pressure. But this situation tested those abilities to their absolute limit. "Bleeding is controlled," Sarah announced finally. "I'm ready to close." As she began suturing Stevens's abdomen, the sound of gunfire suddenly intensified. Enemy fighters were apparently making a final desperate attempt to overrun the American positions before Bravo Company could complete their assault. "Contact left," one of Rodriguez's soldiers shouted. "3 enemy fighters moving toward our position." Rodriguez immediately grabbed his rifle and moved to support his men, leaving Sarah alone with the wounded soldiers. Bullets cracked overhead as she continued working on Stevens, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. The firefight lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours to Sarah as she completed the surgery, while bullets flew around her. When the shooting finally stopped, Rodriguez returned to her side with a concerned expression. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," Sarah replied, putting the final stitches in Stevens's incision. "And so is he. The bleeding is stopped, and he should survive evacuation now." Rodriguez looked down at Stevens, whose color had improved dramatically and whose vital signs were stabilizing. "Bravo 6. This is Relief Force," Rodriguez called into his radio. "Enemy resistance appears to be broken. We're ready for medevac helicopters." The response was immediate. "Relief Force, medevac helicopters are inbound. Landing zone will be secure in 5 minutes." Sarah began preparing the wounded soldiers for evacuation, checking IV lines and ensuring that everyone was stable for transport. Stevens was still unconscious but breathing normally, his pulse steady and strong. "You did it," Rodriguez said quietly. "You actually performed surgery under fire and saved his life." Sarah looked around at the scene of destruction and chaos, then down at the 4 soldiers who would all survive to see their families again. "We all did it," she replied. "Your soldiers provided security, you assisted in surgery, Alpha Company held the perimeter, and Bravo Company broke the enemy attack. This was a team effort." Rodriguez smiled. "You're being modest. What you did here today, performing emergency surgery in the middle of a firefight, that's going to be talked about for years." The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air as 2 Black Hawk medical evacuation helicopters approached the landing zone. Sarah quickly briefed the flight medics on each patient's condition and the treatment they had received, ensuring continuity of care during transport to the surgical hospital. As Stevens was loaded onto a stretcher, he briefly regained consciousness and looked up at Sarah. "What happened?" he asked weakly. "You were injured in an explosion," Sarah explained. "But you're going to be fine. We've stopped the bleeding, and you're being evacuated to a hospital where surgeons will complete your treatment." Stevens nodded slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "Just doing my job," Sarah replied. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. What she had done went far beyond normal nursing duties or standard medical protocols. She had performed emergency surgery under combat conditions, saving a life that would have been lost under any other circumstances. The helicopter lifted off with all 4 wounded soldiers aboard, disappearing into the sky toward the distant hospital. Sarah watched until it was out of sight, then began packing up her medical equipment. "Time to head back to base," Rodriguez announced to his squad. The convoy ride back to Forward Operating Base Falcon was subdued, with everyone processing what had just happened. Sarah found herself emotionally and physically exhausted, the adrenaline that had carried her through the mission finally wearing off. "You know," Rodriguez said as they bounced over the rough road, "when I first met you 3 months ago, I thought you were just another support person who didn't really understand what war was about." Sarah looked at him with interest. "And now?" "Now I think you understand it better than most of us," Rodriguez replied. "You understand that war isn't about killing enemies or capturing territory. It's about protecting the people standing next to you. It's about being willing to risk everything to bring your teammates home." Sarah smiled tiredly. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that too." When they arrived back at the base, word of the mission had already spread throughout the camp. Soldiers who had heard about Sarah's surgery under fire were waiting to congratulate her and hear details of what had happened. But Sarah was surprised to find that the attention didn't feel overwhelming or uncomfortable. These were her fellow soldiers, her comrades, people who understood what she had accomplished and why it mattered. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison met them at the vehicle bay, his expression serious but proud. "Nurse Mitchell, I've received preliminary reports from Alpha Company about what happened out there," he said. "Performing emergency surgery under fire was well beyond the call of duty." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "How are the wounded soldiers doing?" "All 4 are stable and expected to recover fully," Morrison said. "Corporal Stevens is already in surgery at the hospital, and the doctors there said your emergency splenectomy saved his life. Without your intervention, he would never have survived the evacuation." Sarah felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. The risk had been enormous, but it had been worth it. "Sir, if I may," Rodriguez interjected. "Nurse Mitchell's actions today demonstrate that medical personnel can and should be integrated more closely with tactical operations. Her presence made the difference between life and death for our wounded soldiers." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "I agree. We'll be reviewing our protocols for medical support to forward elements. Today proved that having qualified medical personnel available at the point of injury can dramatically improve outcomes." Over the following weeks, Sarah's status on the base continued to evolve. She was no longer seen as a support person or an outsider, but as a full member of the combat team. Her willingness to risk her life for wounded soldiers had earned her the kind of respect that could not be taught or demanded, only demonstrated through action. The cross-training session that Rodriguez had proposed became a regular feature of base operations, with Sarah teaching combat soldiers advanced first aid techniques while learning tactical skills from infantry and armor personnel. The integration of medical and combat training proved so successful that it became a model for other forward operating bases throughout the region. Thompson, Chen, and Foster each approached Sarah individually to offer their apologies for their previous behavior, and all 3 became regular participants in the medical training sessions. Foster, in particular, proved to have a natural aptitude for medical procedures and eventually expressed interest in training as a combat medic. 3 weeks after the mission to rescue Alpha Company, Sarah received another package from Tommy Wilson. This one contained photos of his daughter's first birthday party, along with a letter describing his continued recovery and his work helping other trauma survivors. He had also included newspaper clippings about Sarah's actions in Afghanistan, which had been reported in the Cleveland media after the Army released information about her surgery under fire. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Staff Sergeant Jake Wilson returned to the base on another mission and specifically sought out Sarah to deliver a message from his Special Forces unit. "Ma'am," he said formally, "my team commander wanted me to tell you that what you did out there with Alpha Company is exactly the kind of courage and skill that Special Forces looks for in potential team members. If you ever decide you want a change of assignment, we'd be honored to have you considered for our medical support team." Sarah was stunned by the offer. Special Forces medical personnel were among the most elite soldiers in the Army, trained to provide advanced medical care under the most extreme conditions imaginable. "That's incredibly flattering," Sarah replied, "but I think I'm exactly where I need to be right now." Jake smiled. "I understand, but the offer stands if you ever change your mind, and ma'am, I wanted you to know that my brother has been following the news reports about your service here. He's even more proud now than he was before to have been treated by you." As Jake walked away, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since her arrival at Forward Operating Base Falcon. She had come here as a young nurse trying to prove herself, unsure of her place in the military hierarchy, and struggling to find acceptance among combat soldiers. She was leaving as a proven warrior medic, respected by everyone from privates to senior officers, with a clear understanding of her value to the team. The harassment from Rodriguez and his crew seemed like a distant memory now, a temporary obstacle that had been overcome through persistence, competence, and the kind of dramatic demonstration of courage that left no room for doubt or debate. Sarah had not only proven that she belonged in a combat zone, she had proven that medical personnel were not separate from the fight, but an integral part of it. On her final evening at the base, Sarah sat in the mess hall surrounded by soldiers who had become genuine friends and colleagues. The conversation was relaxed and comfortable, filled with the easy camaraderie that develops between people who have shared danger and hardship together. "So what's next for you?" Corporal Barnes asked. "Another deployment or back to civilian medicine?" Sarah considered the question. She had received offers from several hospitals interested in hiring a nurse with her unique combination of civilian and military experience. She had also been approached by the Army about accepting a commission as an officer and pursuing advanced military medical training. "I'm not sure yet," Sarah replied honestly. "I've got a few months left in my enlistment to think about it." "Whatever you decide," Rodriguez said, "you've set a standard here that's going to be hard to follow. The next nurse who gets assigned to this base is going to have some pretty big shoes to fill." Sarah laughed. "I hope they don't have to perform surgery under fire to earn your respect." "No," Rodriguez replied seriously. "I think I've learned a few things about respect over the past few months. It's not about what uniform you wear or what job you do. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes to accomplish the mission and take care of your people." As the evening wound down and soldiers began returning to their quarters, Sarah took a final walk around the base perimeter. The desert night was clear and quiet, with stars visible in the darkness above. In a few weeks, she would be returning to the United States, to a world where people slept safely, because soldiers like these were willing to serve in dangerous places, far from home. She thought about Tommy Wilson and his daughter Sarah, about Corporal Stevens recovering from his surgery, about all the soldiers she had treated during her deployment. She thought about the young nurse who had arrived at this base 3 months earlier, uncertain and insecure, desperate for acceptance and validation. That nurse was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and more certain of her purpose and value. Sarah Mitchell had come to Afghanistan to serve her country and to prove that she could handle the demands of military medicine. She had accomplished both goals, but more importantly, she had discovered something about herself that she never could have learned in any civilian hospital. She had learned that courage was not about being fearless, but about being willing to act despite fear. She had learned that respect was not given based on rank or position, but earned through competence and dedication. And she had learned that the most important victories were not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when someone chose to risk everything for a fellow human being. Standing in the Afghan desert under a canopy of stars, surrounded by sleeping soldiers who trusted her to care for them if they were wounded, Sarah Mitchell knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. She was a warrior. She was a healer. She was exactly where she belonged. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and victories. But under those same stars, in a small corner of a vast and dangerous world, a young woman had discovered her own strength and earned her place among warriors. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.